Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Emma. Good to see so many of you here today. Some new names along with some familiar ones, so welcome to you all. This subject matter of IR35, I just want to qualify, I really do appreciate the importance of self-employment and the questions and concerns that you may be having in your businesses and organisations. As self-employment is so important to many of our national industries. Taking me back to my first job back in the 90s, believe it or not, when I started out in the construction industry as a quantity surveyor, where the use of self-employed trades, supervisors, and I recall this really vividly, in fact, quantity surveyors and project managers fulfilled self-employed roles as an integral part of our project teams. Therefore, I can say with some great experience then and now that subcontracting definitely still has a place in the world where jobs start and finish quite seamlessly. Specialist services are provided only at certain times to come and exercise specific tasks, and a number of jobs can carry on at any one time. So flexibility and transit working will continue, and labour resources will be needed. That said, the government have been talking about this for a heck of a long time and are really intent on making some changes that I'm now going to talk about. So now that we've set the scene, let's get started. What I would like to cover in the next 20 or 30 minutes, three considerations that I think are really important questions for everybody. Firstly, what is changing? And then to look at the relationship you might have with self-employed workers. You might know them as subcontractors, labour-only subcontractors, subbies. They've got a variety of names, but the government look at them as self-employed workers. And then ultimately, once these changes come afoot, what options have you got in making sure that you maintain legal compliance with the government laws that are coming about? Any questions so far? Hope not. So let's move forward. So we're just going to run a very quick poll to see how confident you feel currently at this point before we've had a chance to chat about IR35 and the changes that are coming about. So Emma's going to kindly launch a poll now. There we go. And on a scale of 1 to, on the scale that's in front of you, from confident, very confident, through to help, can you please just check on there what your feelings are about IR35 at this stage? The results to this are confidential, they're anonymous, so please feel free to openly put what your feelings about IR35 are at this time. Thank you. Let's just give it 20 seconds. Can't see who's voting, so I'm going to count in my head. Another 10 seconds. Okay. Emma, do you think we're ready to reveal the results? Wow, that's really interesting. I hope you can all see that. Nobody is very confident about this at the minute. I've got some work to do then, haven't I? A few people, 36%, quite confident, but the majority are not confident at all or need some help. So hopefully this next 20 minutes or so, we're going to put some clarity on this matter that's going to impact on businesses. So firstly, let's define what a subcontract worker is and how they can appear different to us all as employees, I'm sure. They can be known as labour-only subcontractors, self-employed or subbies, as I've already said. But the government defines them as a person who's self-employed in that they run their business for themselves and take responsibility for its success or failure. They're really important words there. So they take responsibility for their business and its success or failure. The government go on further to say someone can be both self-employed and employed at the same time. For example, somebody could be employed during the day, but running a business at night in a self-employed capacity. So it's really important to know your workforce, what they're doing, and continually appraise your relationship with them if they're self-employed. But if they are self-employed, are you ready for change? I'm confident enough to say that you probably deal with subcontract workers on a regular basis to supplement your own workforce, or even to replace direct employment. As I've said, it has a real place in this world. Think about construction in particular, but also manufacturing and transportation and couriers. Recently, Uber, the delivery company, have been in the press, as were Pimlico Plumbers, about how they engage with self-employed workers. Self-employment is common in flexible out of office or out of factory roles, but it often comes about also in professional roles such as contracts managers, designers and consultants that are commonly engaged on self-employed basis and remits. It's imperative for the circumstances in which each and every subcontract worker is engaged that it's assessed on its own merits and not as a collective pool, including other self-employed workers. So why is the industry keen to subcontract? Well, you look at this as an indicative model towards this. Yes, it offers flexibility and the opportunity to bring in specialist skills, but often it's looked upon financially from a competitiveness perspective. I hear all the time that people rely upon self-employment because it makes them competitive. The government recognise this, and the changes afoot are going to be challenging these relationships. So let's just look quickly at this indicative model. A self-employed worker or an employed worker comparatively, whose revenue, self-employed, or wages as an employee is £40,000 a year. Then for the worker to be self-employed, they will be better off by just over £1,000 per year because of the way that tax is treated against them. But for the business, self-employment is better by at least £4,400 when holidays and pensions and sick pay and national insurance contributions and training are all taken into account. This increases the overhead cost by at least 10% and could have a serious effect on bottom line as well as competitiveness. Financially, it's a no-brainer, but this is what IR35 is about to stop. So here we are, we've talked about it. IR35, it's a set of tax laws which form part of the Finance Act. Believe it or not, IR35 first came about in April 2000, so 21 years ago, almost to the day, and is properly known as intermediaries legislation. Those that remember, IR35 takes its name from the original press release published by the then Inland Revenue, now, as we know and love them, the HM Revenue and Customs, the people who collect our taxes and enforce these laws. So what's changing? On the 6th of April, so a little over 2 weeks' time, changes to IR35 will put the responsibility for assessing IR35 compliance, possibly onto the business or onto the self-employed worker. But as business owners and managers within organisations who use self-employed workers, it's imperative that you know about this and you're assessing the status to ensure that workers have been treated suitably for tax deductions, as the government would expect. So why is the government making these changes to enforce after 21 years or so? Well, think about the money that's currently going into COVID, £280 billion and rising. So the money to plug this gap and fulfill this deficit will have to come from somewhere. That said, it's unfair to say that this is a reaction to the COVID debt, as this was all planned as part of the Good Work Plan in 2018 that was due to be rolled out in the private sector in April last year, but was postponed for 12 months because of the coronavirus pandemic. To add to this, the government has announced that it will break its own peacetime record for borrowing this year, where it's going to be taking on around £355 billion of additional debt. In 2017, these IR35 changes were enforced within the public sector and raised a staggering £550 million in new taxes that ordinarily would not have been raised. So what does this mean for the private sector, which is largely dependent on these flexible and transient working strategies like self-employment, agency workers, 0 hours workers? This is my opinion. This is not taken from any statistics or resource, but I estimate that this could be tenfold increase here. Is this over the top? Have a think about this yourself. So from the 6th of April, all medium and large businesses, which I'll define in a short while, will need to undertake what's called an employment status test for all their self-employed workers if 2 out of the 3 of this following criteria exist. So firstly, does the organisation have an annual turnover of more than £10.2 million? So that's the money it makes in the year. It's its sales, its revenue, what it generates. And secondly, do they have a positive balance sheet value of more than £5.4 million? This will include cumulative profits, any buildings, any plant, equipment, or machinery that they own, and can include cars. And the third criteria is that they employ 50 people or more on their payroll as employees. So as a business, if you tick 2 out of 3 of these boxes, you'll be defined as a medium or large company. But if your company falls out of these criteria, you'll be defined as a small business entity. But there are still rules and there's still obligations on you as a small business to make sure that you are IR35 compliant. So the portal on the government website is called Complete Employment Status for Tax, Cest for short. By completing this assessment form, a contractual agreement is entered into with HMRC. You are making a disclaimer to the government to say that what you're going to input is reflective of the relationship you have with subcontractors. So be honest. Follow the stages for each subcontract worker, answering the questions as honestly and sincerely as you can. Adding incorrect or wrong information could be viewed as blatant tax evasion, subject to fines and possible imprisonment. The Cest portal analyses the arrangements in place with the subcontract worker for payment, for invoicing, for rights to send somebody else to work, that's commonly known as substitution. It looks at the risks for doing the job wrong or in an extraordinary period of time, so it is taken longer than planned. It looks at the responsibilities for paying for plant, materials, and equipment. And it also looks at who fixes the working hours and the arrangement for that relationship. Once you've been through these dozen or so questions, obtain the results and keep them safe for at least 6 years, as this is the time period that HMRC could come back and review your decision making when it comes to IR35 compliance and subcontractor workers. For small companies who engage subcontract workers, then they must insist that the workers intermediary, known as a professional services company, must undertake the Cest. Let me just explain that. The intermediary could be themselves as individuals, or they could be working under a limited company, or a partnership, an LLP as they're commonly known. So if you're a small company, it's the obligation of the self-employed worker and the person who's placing them with you to assess their compliance with IR35. So you might be asking the question, well, can I just check out of this webinar now? I don't need to do anything. Well, let me just say, it's a good point. But have you ever heard of the phrase, fail to prepare and prepare to fail? I think you are much better off being prepared for your next PAYE inspection by having all your ducks in a row. I can say this from experience. Around 2 years ago, so well before IR35 affected the private sector, one of my clients, who was clearly, in terms of this definition, was clearly a small company, but they had a PAYE and VAT inspection for revenue. These inspections, as you may be aware, can happen around every 3 years. Sometimes it's longer, sometimes it's shorter than that. At the end of this inspection, they were left with a demand from the HMRC inspector, demanding them to produce a Cest assessment. Well, this is in 2018, 2019, well before IR35 came about, but this portal, this government portal, and the Cest assessment was available. And they demanded that they produce their Cest assessment for 4 of its own employed workers. I helped them through this. We got the results, HMRC revisited, and were happily content with the results that we got for these 4 self-employed workers, effectively that we could keep them off payroll and self-employed. This intervention from HMRC was against the grain, but it caused a great deal of anxiety that could have been avoided. And going forward, I don't think there are any excuses. So when you've done the Cest, what are the outcomes that you could receive? There could be one of 3. Firstly, it could be defined that the assessment rules the self-employed worker as off payroll. Off payroll indicates that you can carry on subcontracting with the assessed individual on the basis that you already are. Or it could define the worker as being on payroll, indicating that the assessed worker should in fact be classed as an employee. So what are the options for you here? You could redefine your relationship, you could employ them, or you could disassociate your working relationship with them and stop engaging them. I'm seeing quite a bit of resistance here from self-employed workers not willing to change their business model or to come on the books of their client as an employee. There's quite a lot of resistance to that at the minute. It's the obligation of those parties for small companies to negotiate a way forward. But for the medium and large businesses, they need to decide how they're going to continue in that relationship. There is one other option here, and this comes about if the information that's being put into the Cest requires a bit more clarity or information. This is called undetermined. It doesn't say that you need to do nothing, but you need to revisit it with the information that you've provided and rethink about the relationship that you've got with your subcontractors, answering those questions as honestly and sincerely as you can. So if you disagree with Cest, what are your options? You can appeal against it. There is a 45-day period from the date the assessment results were obtained to appeal to HMRC that you disagree with the results and why you disagree with them. But this isn't a legal option. It's not something you can take to court. They're not compelled to assess or amend any decisions. It's just a nice kind of feedback mechanism to engage with the public. So once you've obtained the results, you can put some detail into this. Before you save the results, you can add some details, such as your name and the company. So if you're doing your assessment today, but you don't get an IR30, a PAYE inspection, say for another 3 or 4 years, it's going to be really tricky for you to remember and evidence in a strong manner to HMRC the reasons why you put those answers into the Cest. So you can add some notes like your name, your company, the project, the reasons why the self-employed worker was engaged. I ran through this Cest with a prospective client the other day, and one question was asked about the subcontractor and had they been working for other clients in the last 12 months. The answer to this was no, and that wasn't really in the favour of my client. But this was due to the limitations brought about COVID, and the worker couldn't have worked anywhere else in the last 12 months because there were no opportunities for him to do so. So we put this into the notes, and that will give good evidence to HMRC of the logic that we went through in completing the Cest. As I've said, keep the results of the Cest safe for 6 years, as this is the period HMRC can come back to investigate unpaid taxes. Along with this, you will also need a robust policy, not only to follow and demonstrate to HMRC that you have a management system in place, but you will also need this, believe me, for qualifications, pre-quals, tenders in the future. Rest assured, I'm already being asked for these. Okay, so we've talked about IR35 to some detail there, and I think the proof really is in the pudding of going to the portal, to the .gov portal. You type in complete employment status for tax.gov, and it will take you to that and go through the process. It's not as intuitive and easy to go through as it could be. So if you need any help, then you know where we are. Just to recap then, Emma's going to launch another poll for us now on the same basis as it was at the very outset, same criteria. But now that we've been through all of this, how confident are you now with IR35 and how it could affect your business and the job that you do? Emma's launched the poll. If I could give you another 15 to 20 seconds, that would be great. Thank you. Okay. 5 more seconds. Okay, thanks, Emma. That's what I like to see, some improvement. 9% are very confident now, can move forward. That's great. I'm really happy about that. More people are quite confident about this. The knowledge and the understanding has grown. That's great. I'm really pleased. There's still a few people that are not so happy, and we're here to help with this. It's not just down to you to do it. We've been through the process. We've been talking about this as a team for 2.5 years, so we're au fait with the obligations and the process that you might need to go through. And of course, if it determines that you can carry on in employment or self-employment with the worker, then you've got to think about having what's called a contract for services in place that documents all these rules and agreements that you've got in place that you've entered into the Cest, but to have in a subcontract agreement. Alternatively, where we can help again, we may be that you need to take them on as employees. Think about the employment terms and the policies and procedures that come along there. So without further ado, and before we go to the Q&A, we're going to email you all our most current IR35 policy as a thank you for attending this webinar today. Many of our clients will have already received this, but for anyone wishing to discuss this subject matter further, or our great range of services, then put a yes in the chat now, and my colleague Shani will be in touch to arrange a conversation between you and I about IR35 or any problems that you've got. So here we go to Q&A. Thank you. I'm going to go on to the Q&A in a minute. Feel free in the meantime to connect to me on LinkedIn to keep up to date with the most current developments affecting employers and businesses. Before I start, can I just say I've over the last few weeks, I've had a recurring question from many of my clients about the obligations to share turnover information and balance sheet values and staff numbers with labour supply agencies. The labour supply agencies are simply doing this to ensure that they are IR35 compliant, to assess who is responsible for completing the Cest. So let's go up to the first question that's come in. Is there a site to test the Cest in a non-contractual way to assess future roles? So the Cest is, you don't input any personal data in there, so it is quite anonymous. It's anonymous until the point that you print it and save it and present it to HMRC at an inspection. So you could do this for future roles, just to give you an indication of whether they might be classed as off or on payroll and how you might engage with those. You can then destroy the results. It has no bearing because you've not engaged that individual. So I don't see a problem with that at all. And you can do as many of these tests as you like. The portal's free and it's available. So Jeffrey's asked, is it possible to do a Cest test case to see what the outcomes may be without the official test? I think that answered before. Yes, you can still use the government portal to go through this as a hypothetic, as an example. So hopefully that's helped. Sheil has asked a question, does IR35 impact the care industry? Yes, it does. Anybody who is deemed to be self-employed, it affects them. There's no exemption to this. Sorry about that. Gordon's asked, should a small business use the Cest? I don't think you need legally to use the Cest, but you need to ensure your self-employed workers have done it themselves and provided you with a copy of the results. As a small company, can I complete the Cest on behalf of subcontractors? The law says that you shouldn't be involved in it. It is pushing the responsibility onto the intermediary, what was called the personal services company, or the individual that you're engaging with. Adela, there's a bit of a question of how can we access individuals? Do you want to just carry on with the question? I'll come back to that. Michelle has asked, does IR35 impact on temporary employment agencies? E.g., we employ temporary workers via an agency when needed. So if you fulfill the criteria, Michelle, of being a large or medium organisation, then you will need to do the Cest. But if you're a small organisation, according to the criteria, then the employment agency must do the Cest and provide you with the results of that. And that is where they might be asking you for information like turnover, balance sheet values, numbers of employees, just to verify who is really responsible for this. Sheila, is that a repeat question? Sorry. How does it impact the care industry? Again, self-employed workers, anyone who is off payroll that you're employing and paying them gross in terms of their day rate, their hourly rate, or whatever they work, then they will be considered as self-employed off payroll workers at this time. The obligation, again, whether you're small, medium, or large, is to who does the Cest assessment. It might be that the self-employed nurse or carer has to do the Cest as the individual, the intermediary to that relationship. If it helps, happy to have another conversation offline, Sheila, about this issue. Adela, assess individuals before speaking to them. What questions should be asked for self-employed individuals who themselves have a limited company? I think by and large, Adela, you're going to know how you engage and relate with those self-employed consultants, those workers, those carers. So I think you're going to have the majority of the information at hand, ready to do the Cest now, rather than ask for additional information. But if you are then defined as the medium or large business, it's your duty to do that assessment and then work on the results, whether it deems them to be on payroll or off payroll. If a Someone's asked if a contractor is hired off payroll, are they required to have an intermediary to process the tax deductions? Yeah, well, the intermediary could be themselves. So if you've got Dave Jones as your worker who you're paying directly, then it's Dave Jones. If you're a small company, Dave Jones is responsible for procuring his own tax, reporting it to the revenue, and paying the right amount of tax to HMRC when it falls due. Michelle's asked, if Cest results is off payroll, what do we need to do about these workers? You can carry on if they're off payroll. You can carry on contracting with them as self-employed workers, as long as one thing is maintained, that you continue to assess your relationship with them. Say every 3 to 6 months, you continue to run the Cest, or and that you have some form of written contract or agreement with them. A contract for services is the common mechanism that you would use to engage with them, and basically it would translate all the answers that you've put into the Cest into an agreement about how the relationship will manifest and carry on. So Tony has asked, what are the fundamental criteria for the Cest assessment? So going through the dozen or so questions, and I referred to this in one of the earlier slides. Sorry, Tony. It was if it looks at the relationship between the parties in terms of pay, who is responsible for putting defects right, what the working hours are agreed between those individuals. Can the self-employed worker send somebody else if they are not available to do the work? As I say, there are a dozen or so questions here that come about asking whether there is a true self-employed relationship there, or in effect, are the self-employed workers shadowing what an employee would do? And that's what IR35 is interested in. Happy to go through this online with you, Tony, if that would help as a hypothetical assessment, if nothing else. Parveen has asked, if the options are on payroll and off payroll, then on payroll, does that mean that they are employed? Yes, on payroll means that they need to come onto your books. And what is the relationship with the contractor? Well, if the outcome says that they should be on payroll, I think you've got 3 options. One is that you agree to bring them on as employees onto your books. 2 is that you alter the way that you work with them, that they join another organization, or they start to work for other people. Or 3 is that you disassociate your relationship with them. And that usually comes about when you can't agree to option one and option 2. But the obligation there is to do something if the Cest says that they're on payroll. And I think this is the last question coming up from Gordon. How does the status of a worker as a sole trader or limited company affect this? Again, going back to the definition of an intermediary, it could be an individual, it could be a limited company, it could be an LLP. So I don't think there is any effect there on who it is and how they organize themselves, but it could have a real profound effect on the outcome of the Cest assessment. For example, if they're a limited company and they invoice for their works and they work for other people, the view is starting to look like they should be off payroll and self-employed. But again, we can go through this, Gordon, if it would help. Thank you, everybody. And no other questions. I really don't bet. I would like to thank everybody for attending today. There's some amazing questions that have come up there. Put me on the spot with a few of those. We're here to help. If anybody wants to come back and have a one-to-one or a discovery call with me, then you know what to do. Either put it into the chat or contact Shani or myself in advance. I haven't got any more to say. I hope that's really been useful and helpful to you all today. this is happening. We've got 2 weeks to this. Good luck with it. Stay safe and look after yourselves and your families while we go through this coronavirus. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.